Welcome to Sports Geek, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host, who is always looking for ways to leverage digital platforms to increase revenue for sports teams, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. My name is Sean Callanan, and welcome to episode 329 of Sports Geek. On this week's episode, I catch up with Queensland Rugby Union's Pete Fairbairn about all things rugby, PR and content. Thank you very much for listening. You can always contact me via email, sean@sportsgeekhq.com, or via our socials at SportsGeek or at Sean Callanan on most platforms. Thank you very much for listening. Really enjoy this catch up with Pete. Known him for a long time across his tenure across rugby and in different phases of PR and commercial and content. He is now at the Queensland Rugby Union, where he's head of commercial there. So please enjoy my chat with Pete Fairbairn from the QRU. Very happy to welcome Pete Fairbairn from Queensland Rugby Union. He's the head of commercial. Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on, mate.
No problems. Well, really do appreciate you booking the time. And like I do with most chats, I want to find out, how did you get your start in the world of sports business?
Yeah, look, for me, it's probably a pretty similar journey to a lot of the other guests that you've had on the pod over the years, in the sense that from a very young age, my priorities in life were sport, and grew up watching and playing anything I could, and with aspirations of doing something within the sporting industry, and probably realistic enough at probably the start of high school to be able to establish that I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, and instead decided to start thinking about media and writing and journalism and those types of skills. And then from that point, really everything was directed towards that goal. From a really young age, I was never going to do anything other than work in sport.
Yeah, so those first couple of roles were in that PR assistant, PR and comms, PR and events across a few different agencies, and then also in the betting space with BetStar. Were they your sort of first sort of foray of running events, understanding the media landscape? Like you said, a bit of journalism. Was it learn a bit of everything in those first couple of roles?
Yeah, absolutely. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. My dad was a school headmaster. So, right from kind of my teenage years, I always worked in hospitality. I was really lucky living in New Zealand when I was finishing high school, had good friends whose family owned venues. So I got the opportunity to work in bars, restaurants, cafes, develop kind of leadership, at a pretty young age there and lead teams. But moved back to Australia around age 22, moved to Melbourne very much with the intention of working in the world of sport. And my goal was always to work in the AFL world. That was my first love as sport, and Melbourne was the obvious place to try and do that. Moved back to Melbourne, got my first role at Thrive PR as a PR assistant, working on some great sports accounts. From there, went and worked for a fellow by the name of Corey McKernan for a couple of years as his publicist and around his events business he had at the time, and then, as you say, ended up at BetStar, which was really fascinating for me. I'd never been a racing fan. I'd never been a huge punter. So going into a workplace, with a trading floor and trying to establish BetStar's reputation and credentials with the media in Melbourne, ahead of competitors and try to generate column inches, crediting BetStar was a great challenge for a young, hungry PR proponent. And so from there, fortunate enough to end up at the Melbourne Rebels, which was the beginning of my journey in rugby as their media manager. And that was my first exposure to a full-time professional sporting organisation.
Yeah, terrific. I think we probably did cross paths, obviously, at networking events. I did some work with Corey McKernan around some of his Super Bowl events as well. He does a lot. He does events and then the tours. The Rebels, part of the Super Rugby, like you said, so your first foray into rugby. I mean, your story, there's a lot of connection. My dad was also a school teacher, so we moved around lots, and so you learn to be adaptable for multiple situations. But your first role in as a media manager for the Rebels, a lot of people in Melbourne love their sport, and then they do see the AFL as the pinnacle, and that's the place to go. What was it like working for the Rebels? We've had Baden Stevenson, CEO of the Rebels, on the podcast previously. It's really, a challenger brand in an AFL market, an AFL-dominated market. What was it like fighting, like you said, for Betstar, fighting for column inches in a town that loves the Sharon and doesn't exactly put its arms around Super League, Super Rugby, I should say.
Yeah, great question. And Baden, he was general manager of football while I was there. I reported into him, and he's a great operator. I was really fortunate, I think, having spent time living in Queensland and in New Zealand, that rugby union and Super Rugby, I was really familiar with it. Yep. And I was also fortunate that I joined the Rebels when the club was only a couple of years old. So I always think that's a great opportunity, because it means that no ideas off the table. There's not really the case of that's how it's always been done. So you can come in with fresh ideas, a new approach. Even at that young age, I had learnings I could employ from my time with Betstar and relationships I already had within the media down in Melbourne, where I was able to kind of help orchestrate some pretty successful campaigns and get those column inches. We were really lucky at the time that The Age, the Herald Sun and AAP all had a great journo at each that covered the Rebels and the Storm. Unfortunately for the Rebels, they don't have that now in the same way. But it was really important to manage those relationships really well and make sure that all three organisations got looked after. And, there were times when you'd do something to make one happy and you had to make sure you're almost keeping score in the back of your mind of who gets the lick of the ice cream next. And then, rugby union, most of the most credentialed rugby union journalists were based in Sydney or Queensland. So how did you make sure you kept them on side as well and kept them engaged with what you were doing? Because the reality is, in Super Rugby, the product is a breeding ground for wallabies. So you're wanting to make sure that some of your top players are still getting that exposure, and that rugby fans all over the country still know about some of these guys as they're coming through. So how do you make sure that you're selling the right stories into those interstate media as well, who have that national footprint and the opportunity to give that great exposure to some of your best players and to what you're doing as an organisation?
Yeah, so for the listeners who don't know, the Wallabies you refer to are Australia's national rugby team, and held in high esteem, and multiple World Cup winners, and that's what all the players do level up with, and that's sort of where your next role came and sort of started to expand your skill set, being in the communications and the commercial manager for the Rugby Union Players Association. I'm interested, working on that Players Association side, we're seeing them do a lot more work over the past 10 years, for players, but also in the media space, but then also starting to spread your wings into the commercial space. What did that role challenge you, and what were some of the opportunities in that role?
Yeah, it was a great opportunity to shift up to Sydney. My wife was working at the AFL, and we shifted to Sydney, and she was fortunate enough to get an opportunity with the Sydney Swans. So it was a great transition for us. And for myself, after a few years at the Rebels, being that media manager, touring with the team, working at Rupa was an opportunity to really broaden my skill set and my horizons a little bit. So I arrived with a great, what I thought was a great knowledge of the Australian rugby landscape, which I soon learned that being in the thick of it in Sydney was a completely different political beast. I knew very little about the Player Association space, aside from a few dealings with the AFL Players Association, in earlier roles in Melbourne. So that kind of collective bargaining and that side of things was all pretty new to me, but it was just a great group of people, around a dozen employees at the time, 5 or 6 of us in the head office. And then in a situation that remains to this day, each of the Australian Super Rugby teams had a player development and welfare manager who was ensconced within that organisation, but was actually an employee of Rupa, which was unique in the Australian market and pretty unique in the world, I think, where our colleagues were wearing a Queensland Reds or a Melbourne Rebels polo shirt every day and sitting in the office there, but actually employed by Rupa, and predominantly focused on the well-being and the off-field development of the playing group, in those cities. So there was a dozen of us who were all doing it for the right reason. We all, and for me, some of this affinity grew over time around that genuine care and pride in the players, and that belief that without the players you don't have a product. My role initially was communications manager, and that was promoting the exploits of our players on and off the field. Past players, also trying to really heavily promote our programs and the things we were doing around that wellbeing space, and then obviously any kind of situational things that occurred around collective bargaining or player disciplinary issues. I worked through the Israel Folau saga at Rupa. I worked through the axing of the Western Force from the Super Rugby competition, and that was a lot of crisis comms, which was enjoyable is the wrong word because a lot of people's well-being was at stake, but certainly a great learning experience and gave me unbelievable opportunity to develop in that space. But that being said, at the time, a guy called Ross Zenos was the CEO, who's a mentor of mine, and after kind of 18 months in the role, I said to Ross, I want to continue to challenge myself and diversify my skill set. And I look at you as somebody whose career I'd love to kind of emulate. And I do have aspirations in that executive world. What opportunities are there for me to add to my current workload? And being a players association, we did have some commercial partners that were really important in providing funding and opportunity for us to deliver the programs we did. But we didn't really have a dedicated partnership manager. So, within the 4 or 5 staff in that Sydney office, we probably all kind of looked after a couple of partners each. And depending on whose workload was the busiest, who might jump in and help when something needed to be done. So he proposed formalising that and putting that commercial skew to my role where I managed those relationships and the deliverables and ensured that all of those partners were having a great experience, which is pretty challenging when you don't have a jersey to sell. You do have to think outside the square to make sure they're getting, real benefit out of their investment. And that also put me on the path to going out and trying to pitch to prospective new partners or trying to extend relationships, in terms of trying to convince partners to invest more money and be more heavily involved. And that was just a wonderful opportunity to do that. I was really fortunate to get that little bit of an introductory commercial exposure in that sense. And from there, it definitely illustrated to me that, diversifying my skill set outside of purely media and PR and communications was only going to be advantageous for me.
Yep. And so, I mean, after you did a good stint of 5 years at the Rugby Union Players Association, you went back to Thrive, where you started you started your journey. What was sport and PR like? In that 10 years that you'd been fresh faced kid when you started at Thrive, studying in the space, to go back in a more senior role for a couple of years. How did the sports media PR landscape change in that time?
Yeah, it was a really fascinating opportunity that came up. It kind of coincided with us having our first child and being open to a move into state, up to Queensland, where we would have greater support. And Leilani Abels, who's the founder of Thrive, and so good at what she does, Leigh and I had always kept in touch. We stumbled across each other, many times over the years. And she actually reached out, believe it or not, on the day my son was born, the 29th of December, which shows that she doesn't take holidays, and said, Pete, I've got a role for you as our head of sport. Let's make it happen. And things moved pretty quickly from there. We're able to start off the role in Sydney, and then so I delivered the kind of PR lead operations around Sale GP in Sydney, one of our clients, which was fantastic. I think that was my first or second week at Thrive, leading our team and trying to generate as many column inches as we could there. And then as COVID kind of came through, we were able to shift up here to Queensland. And I guess what I'd seen in terms of the evolution of the media landscape was probably more challenges for niche or boutique sports to get that cut through. The kind of big sports of AFL, rugby league, cricket, tennis 3 weeks a year, and horse racing probably taking 90% of space as opposed to 50 or 60 earlier in my career. So really looking outside the square for if you're working with somebody like a Sail GP or then I did a lot of work at Thrive for tourism events Queensland. When we had a lot, we did have the AFL relocate here and did a lot of great work around that, but also pre-Tokyo Olympic Games training camps based out of Queensland. So trying to generate PR for cycling and athletics and swimming and rugby sevens and some of these other sports as well. Just the need to get really creative, to get the great visual component right, whether it's video or stills, and to cultivate relationships with your key media. It's something that, for me has always been something I've really enjoyed is meeting journos, developing relationships with them. I'm fascinated by the media industry and always have been, by the movements of journalists and what they write and why they write and how they write. That's something that has always really fascinated me. So having really strong relationships and the ability to pitch a great story into a journo who's going to give you the time of the day based on having that respect for you in the first instance was really helpful. I think in that sports space, particularly if you are outside those kind of half a dozen or so bigger sports, you need to be able to nail your pitch pretty quickly, and you need to be able to demonstrate to a media outlet, if they're not, one specifically relevant to your sport, you need to be able to demonstrate really clearly and articulate why it's going to be interesting for somebody who isn't a diehard fan of that sport to consume the content.
Terrific. So that brings us to, you're in your current role at Queensland Rugby Union, which is the state organising body for rugby union in Queensland, both from a participation point of view and then also the Queensland Reds, I should say, in Super Rugby. As head of commercial, what were some of the first things, sort of when you got stuck into that role? What were some of the first things on your agenda to go? What were you looking to tackle? What were some of the opportunities with Queensland Rugby Union?
Well, really similar to Thrive in that, I started at Thrive and I had some transferable skills from previous roles, but even things as simple as logging and tracking your time against a client, were alien to me. I'd forgotten that we did that 10 years earlier. Leading teams of the size that I did at Thrive, I hadn't done that since being a bar manager, over a decade earlier. So there was some development I had to do on the run there fairly quickly that which challenged me, which I loved. Similar at the QRU in the sense that, when I was in discussions about the role, I was able to be quite transparent about my commercial experience being relatively lean in comparison to my communications experience, but having a really thorough understanding of the Queensland and the Australian sporting landscape, of the rugby landscape, specifically having worked in rugby in 2 states, and really valuing the importance of connecting with people and maintaining relationships and being a strong and transparent communicator. They were kind of the trademarks, that I linked my initial kind of application to, and from my perspective, the ability to learn about the value of a particular partnership and to articulate that, and the ability to develop contacts and people who I could speak to about commercial opportunities. That would be easy enough to develop. That would come in time, but some of those hallmarks of how I go about my work and how I communicate with stakeholders, external and internal, they were going to put me in good stead. And I think, the proof has been in the pudding that we've been able to do that. I came in as the Super Rugby season was kicking off in February of 2022. So having existing relationships with players and knowing some of the staff there was obviously beneficial to get buy-in for what we were doing. And I was able to really focus on developing relationships with our commercial partners straight away. And we're really fortunate. We've got a fantastic blue chip list of commercial partners here that's the envy of most organisations in the country. So it became a case of how do I make sure we can clearly articulate the business impact that we're having for these partners. and I think, and we can talk about that, I think that has shifted a lot, right? What people are expecting when they invest their money in a sports partnership.
Well, that was one of the questions that I had, especially you coming from, the PR and media background, and how much that has shaped your views on sponsorship, and also, where you put value on a sponsorship and what your pitch looks like. Because we do see, some people in the commercial space are, really focus on the logos on the jerseys or what the hospitality piece looks like. And then you'll have others that'll be, real sales and performance led and how they can bring in customers. And then you'll have digital folk like me saying, oh, here's what the digital value is in different components, whether it be your own, your earned, what social looks like. How, where's your philosophy? Because I think there's no right answer, but it's sort of like, how do you go about your pitch and presenting value to Reds partners or QRU partners?
Yeah, I think the first thing we've had to ascertain is what is the main reason that an organisation chooses to invest in a partnership. What are they looking to achieve? Is it brand awareness? Is it business impact? And then, how do they think we can deliver it for them? And then we can also come over the top with some expertise or some learnings that they may not have as well. So we've got a great team that we're all, we all work on the same page. We're all committed to the same kind of outcomes. And then interdepartmentally within the QRU, you referenced digital. We've got a great Marcoms team who I know that they can produce fantastic content. Content's great for exposure for partners, and it's great for an organisation like us because it doesn't have a hard cost associated with producing great content. So it's obviously a resource commitment and it's time, but we can produce really compelling content that is going to expose our partners to as many people as possible and position them in a certain way. That's something that we've loved being able to do and have done really effectively. All those traditional things, the signage in venue, being on a jersey, that's all fantastic. It's really measurable. But you can't control wins and losses in this role. So you need to make sure that you're not relying entirely on team performance. And when it comes to things like hospitality, what we've found is that, and I think this probably reflects broader trends around sports attendance in Australia, is that the days of filling corporate suites, with people who, are just so grateful to be there, are perhaps slightly behind us. Yes, there's still a place for a corporate suite, and for some of our brands, some of our partners, that they'll fill those every week, and they'll fill them with a range of internal, external stakeholders, clients, prospective clients. But for other people, they'd rather be in a shared networking facility. And we're lucky that at Suncorp Stadium, Centreline Lounge opened this year. 200 packs, open facility, on the halfway line on the western side of the stadium. That's been really advantageous for us to get our people in there together, networking, with past players, with current, injured players, with board members, whoever that might be. That's been really good as well. So I guess in summary, Sean, it's been about really trying to make sure we know what our partner wants to achieve. We do great B2B opportunities within our partners where they offer each other exclusive discounts or services that they wouldn't be able to access if it wasn't through being part of our network. I don't think we can understate the value of that. And then it's about making sure we deliver what we say we're going to deliver. I've seen so many partnerships in my time in sport where the commercial team come in, sign off a partnership, get the dollars that they need to hit a target or to achieve their KPIs. Then there's a whole bunch of deliverables in a partnership that marketing or a comms team turn around and say we can't do that, or that just don't get done because there's nobody there proactively at the partner's end checking in to say, hey, just wanted to make sure we've got our 12 EDM mentions for the year, this, that and the other. And then what happens is you get to the final 6 months of that partnership, you begin those renewal conversations, and they say, well, can we just double check that you've delivered everything you said you would in the contract? People go, oh, well, we haven't delivered everything, and this is why. And you see that organisations, sporting bodies have to go back to the well and try and convince somebody new to come in and start from zero. We're very much focused on a retention model where we want our partners to stay with us for as long as possible. And if that means we leave a little bit of money on the shelf when we could, potentially attract a new partner in the same category who wants to come in and throw their cash around. But we know who we're working with. We know what they're looking to achieve. We've got those relationships there where they have faith in us to deliver on what we say we're going to do and some. In the long haul, that's a far better use of resource and time rather than going back to the well and trying to attract, big new partners every year or two. I mean, there's going to be times when you have to do that. Of course, partnerships don't have infinite lifespans, but if you can focus on providing a truly outstanding partnership experience for your partners, and at the risk of oversimplifying it, I don't think it's that hard. If you make sure that you're signing agreements in the first instance which aren't heavily skewed in one party's favour, you're not trying to deliver the world knowing you're not, promise the world knowing you're not going to deliver it. And on the flip side, you're not taking advantage of somebody's inexperience in the space to sign off on a deal where they're not getting that much in return for what they're investing. If you make sure that your deals are really evenly weighted, that you communicate really, really clearly, and that you're responsive, you're transparent, you're honest, and you bring them on the journey along with you. What I've found is that it's not rocket science what we do, and if you approach it with the right attitude, that you can do a great job.
Yeah, I do think obviously the servicing, and again that mad scramble, it's like the Game of Thrones meme, winter is coming. It's like, oh, here's all the campaigns coming that's in the last third of the season when people have realised they haven't delivered. Like that's always the red flag to your team that's going to make renewals harder. But the point at the start of, we call it the Spice Girl strategy, asking the sponsor what do they want, what they really, really want. And so you actually get, exactly what they want. If they want, I want to meet more people and do more business, then you fit for the networking lounge. Or, no, I want more people to know about my brand. Oh, cool, we will build out a really great content series and also profile you on the stadium scoreboard. It's like, if you're just going with, here's our deck and please pick the package that is named after a precious metal, like it's not going to work, because it's, everyone is different. So if you can start at a point, like you said, knowing what they actually want, and then, you're right, it's not rocket science, actually deliver on that. It's really important.
Yeah, I think as well, Sean, just to close off on that, I think making sure that you're giving the same respect to your number one highest investor in our case our principal partners, all the way through to what might be a contra partnership, which is specifically to offset a hard cost. It might be for some supplements for the team, or something like that is a case of filling a need. Those interactions still need to be that same level of quality. And again, it's not that hard to do. If you have a good team and you're all swimming in the same direction, obviously your principal partners, you're spending more time with them, but the experience is being mirrored throughout your entire suite of partners.
Yeah. So one of the things that is, unique to, I think it's unique to Australia, is this term Code Wars, which is looking at all the different football codes that we have here in Australia. We've already mentioned a couple with, the AFL, primarily its focus in Melbourne. You've got the NRL, which is more of a northern states, the rugby league. And then, you've also got soccer, or, the thing is, I can't call them all football because everyone wants to call themselves football. And then also rugby union. It's very unique that all of them are fighting for that winter, for the most part, for that winter sport dominance. Like, can you give us a bit of an insight into you've been in rugby for a fair while. What's your take on the state of rugby now? And, sometimes from the outside looking in, the perception, especially, coming in different parts of Australia or around the world, might not actually match what reality is. So where do you think rugby is right now?
Well, I think rugby union's a sport of real extremes, in the sense that the Rugby World Cup is the Men's Rugby World Cup is the third largest sporting event in the world. So we've got this incredible base with rugby played in over 120 countries, men and women, 15 aside. Rugby sevens is in the Olympic Games. That the scope for rugby union is fantastic, and it's like Joseph Suaalii is obviously a big name defection recently, returning to rugby, the sport he played as a schoolboy in 2025, leaving the NRL. And someone said, would you rather play in Penrith or in Paris? And that's one of the opportunities that rugby union gives to its athletes is the chance to play all over the world, but also to its fans. At the moment, being a Rugby World Cup year, working in the rugby space, every second person's asking, am I going to see you in France at the Rugby World Cup? I've got my tickets booked. I can't wait. And so you've got this sport that, despite some of the challenges around, certainly around the physicality and concussion and that sort of thing, and also I guess putting getting a globally aligned calendar is something that rugby's always struggled with, and the battle between the North and the South to come together, which are two major issues confronting rugby. You do have a sport that is in fairly good health, globally. Then in Australia, you have a scenario where Super Rugby probably hasn't been able to really find its place in the landscape and has slowly drifted at times towards more of a niche or a boutique status. I don't think that's entirely self-inflicted. I think that, as I referenced earlier, the media landscape has shifted towards a focus on those big half dozen sports, and probably with the exception of the NBL, who I think, I don't know a lot about basketball, but I've just watched the emergence of that competition and its relevance in the industry. They've done a fantastic job to buck the trend, but you only have to look at netball, at the A-League, at a number of other sports to see that it's a shrinking space we're competing for. Super Rugby's biggest challenge has always been that as a competition, until 3 years ago, for the first 25 years of its existence, it was hidden behind a paywall. It was only available on Fox Sports, and that meant that the exposure to new audiences wasn't there. And we also had situations where we were playing South African teams at 2:00 in the morning, which it's pretty hard to convince a 6-year-old to watch that game as opposed to watching a game at 3:00 in the afternoon on the MCG, Collingwood Essendon. So I think the other challenge Super Rugby has also had is that whilst it's been widely regarded as the toughest provincial rugby competition in the world for a long time, it's also been seen as a feeder competition into that international selection, right? And if I would look for a synergy in another sport, I'd look at the demise in the mass market relevance of the Sheffield Shield, where playing
from a cricket point of view, yeah, absolutely,
we're playing cricket for Australia. Men's or women's cricket is the pinnacle, and playing for your state happens a bit off Broadway. Super Rugby is not as off Broadway as that, but players get rested from Super Rugby matches as part of their Wallaby protocols, and to protect them so they're not playing too much footy, so they can be at their best in gold. With that in mind, it's really hard to position Super Rugby as the pinnacle competition when you know that ultimately it's a 16-week possibles versus probables competition to try and get in that gold jersey. And there's no golden bullet to fix that. I think that what it does do is it puts the onus on the state unions and the Super Rugby clubs to probably work a little bit independently, sometimes of Rugby Australia, to really focus on our job. So yes, our job is to give our players the best possible environment to succeed, to be selected for the Wallabies and the Wallaroos. Of course, that's an important part of what we do. But our most important thing is to have a great Super Rugby and Super W experience. Lots of fans, lots of engagement across our channels, lots of exposure for our partners, lots of people watching on television at home.
And, that last point there around, you can't be what you can't see, like the new deal with Nine and Stan just making Super Rugby more accessible for more people is, it's you've got the initial data coming through, but that, the longer tail effect of, like you said, you can turn it on on a Saturday or Sunday and see a match and see it live and it's accessible. Like, do you think that's going to have a more of a longer tail effect to bring more people in to get some more cheeks in the seats?
Look, I hope so. I think it's progress. I think with every step forward, sometimes there's a half step back. So you look at the fact that most licensed venues probably don't have Stan Sport, or other streaming services might not have Paramount Plus to show the A-League, for example. So yes, we've got that one game live on free-to-air television on a Saturday on Gem, which is great. Yes, we have the Wallabies on Channel 9 when they're playing, which is fantastic. And certainly up here in Queensland in the later stages of our Store Local Hospital Cup, which is, I guess, the VFL equivalent. Some of that gets played on free-to-air towards the back end of the season, which is great. But if you want to walk into a pub with your mates on a Friday night, it's pretty hard to watch Super Rugby. And that's, that's one of the downfalls of the move away from Fox Sports to Nine Entertainment. You used to be able to walk into a pub and see Super Rugby, NRL, AFL on the A-League on 4 TVs next to each other and kind of decide which you want to focus on, but keep an eye on all 4. And we're missing that exposure now. And then obviously, and I say this with respect because I've got some great friends who work for news, but since rugby went over to Nine, news doesn't cover the sport really anymore, unless they're looking for bad news stories or unless it's just so big they have to. So sure, around the Rugby World Cup time or when the Wallabies play, you'll see a little bit, but gone are the days of being able to open the Daily Telegraph or the Courier Mail and see 2 or 3 articles about rugby union every day. It just doesn't happen. So that's been one of the pitfalls of the move to Nine as well. So I tend to think that in rugby in Australia, and as I say, I've been fortunate to work in 3 different states. So I think I've got a pretty good grasp on the game nationally now, and the different attitudes towards the game in those different locations. I think at times it's been a bit of a badge of honour for people in rugby to be really proud of their insularity around it and say, I don't watch AFL, I don't watch NRL, I'm a rugby person, I'm 3rd generation Randwick Junior, and that's all I'll watch. I'm not interested in the other sports. But I think what we need to see, and what I see up here in Queensland a lot, is more willingness to learn from the other sports and to actually truly follow what they're doing and not necessarily always see them through the lens of being a threat, but also see what opportunities they might provide us. So I look at the Dolphins and their launch here in Brisbane, the crowds that they're generating at Suncorp Stadium. What that shows me is that there are a lot of people here in Queensland who want to attend live sport. So what can we do in terms of our game day experience, our game day presentation, to make it compelling to actually increase our attendances, despite the fact that people attending live sport is trending down a little bit nationally? What learnings can we take from what the Dolphins are doing? How can we continue to invest in our game day? And we're really lucky in Queensland that we don't have the same concentration of teams that Sydney or Melbourne has. So the reality is that if you talk to someone in the streets in Brisbane and they're a sports fan, they'll probably say, they might say, look, I'm a Broncos diehard, that's my number one sport, but yeah, I like the Reds, yeah, I like the Lions, yeah, I like the Raw. So how do you get that person who might only go to a Reds game, once a year or once every couple of years? How do you get them to have such a great experience when they do come that all of a sudden the idea of coming the next week or buying a 3-game membership, which evolves into a full season membership, how do you make that transition for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to my chat with Loretta Johns from the Swans, sort of them looking to package up and market the Swans as an entertainment option, because not everyone is like that. You were saying before, that rusted on, this is how I consume rugby, this is how I consume my footy. Like, what does that entertainment look like? What entertainment option look like? How do you just bring them into, your tent a little bit more? Because not everyone is that, that older, this is, wearing as a badge of honor, because, everyone, like all trends, we're all trying to chase that younger fan, and they've got different demands. They consume their sport differently. We've spent a lot of time talking about, what we would say is traditional media, both from a free to air and a print point of view, but there's a whole bunch of fans that don't consume any of that content. When you say, hey, have you ever, changed a channel or a remote? And they don't even know how to, use a remote, because they're only going straight to a streaming service, or they're only watching YouTube or TikTok. And so, you really have to open up your mind to say, well, it's great to have the rusted on fans, but if we do, our future depends on us being able to bring in, this next generation. And then what does that fan base look like in 10 to 15 years? That's a challenge for every, administrator. But also, yeah, like you said, the birth of the Dolphins in the NRL in your market shows that there are still people that want, live experience, that want to be part of a tribe, that want to take in, the theatre that is sport. It's still, one of the best, reality TV shows out there, because you don't know what's going to happen, and sort of developing that fan experience. So you're more than, more than willing to look at other codes and, like you said, not see them as a threat, but, steer with pride. Oh, they're doing that well. How can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up an obsessed fan in a number of codes. I came to rugby, a little bit later in life. I remember going to matches at Ballymore when I was kind of 12, 13, and that was my first real exposure to Super Rugby. We didn't have Foxtel at home, so I hadn't seen it on telly. But I'm an avid supporter of half a dozen codes, and I really see what the other codes are doing. I'm a lot of fun at parties, Sean, because I'm fascinated by things like media movement, broadcast deals, partnership, major partnerships in other codes. I keep a really close eye on that sort of thing and look for opportunities, where the Reds can benefit from that. I mean, you referenced the rusted on fans. The reality is that there are some rusted on diehard fans who've decided that the broadcast experience at home is better for them than going to a game. And we need both. We need fans watching on TV or on a streaming service, and we need fans at the venue to provide the atmosphere that makes it look so attractive to those watching at home. So rather than relying on those rusted on fans, it's about converting new fans. It's about ensuring that we're giving them a great experience when they come to venue or when they watch via broadcast. I think rugby really should be aspirational around trying to be up with some of the latest trends of how broadcast is done globally. And certainly on our Queensland Reds game day, we're constantly tweaking it to try and make sure that not that every dead second is filled with noise and action for the sake of it, but the reality is that rugby union does have some stop-start elements to it. It does have quite a complicated set of rules. So how do we make sure that someone in the stadium who is kind of learning as they go and hasn't necessarily grown up with the sport is having just as good time as somebody who is at their 100th Reds game?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it does provide a challenge when we're going from mass, which is what the traditional media is, to so many more, the fragmentation, whether it be via the different streamers that are available, but then also, your team is creating its own content and telling those stories and talking to those different fans. And what works for the rusted on fan is you still need to do that educational piece of content for that fan that's never been to a game. And what am I watching here? Or this isn't like, rugby league. I understand that. What are the differences? So you've got to balance that. And one of the podcasts, one of the media pieces is podcasting. You do that at the Reds. Like, I'm a big advocate, obviously being a podcaster, I'm a big advocate for podcasting as a content type for sports. Why does it work for the Reds, and why do you guys podcast?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a little bit of fun doing some kind of late nights or evenings and overnights on SEN back in Melbourne, over 10 years ago, and got a little bit of exposure to radio and really loved the hosting side of things. And then during COVID, I kind of ran my own podcast for 6 or 7 months, where I had a different sports journalist from around the country on with me every day, and we dissected the 5 biggest stories in the world of sport, had it out by 7:30 every morning, and had a lot of fun doing that. So my own consumption and experience of podcasts has increased dramatically in recent years, and it's become a really important way for me to consume media. So when I went into the Reds, I identified that from through a commercial lens, through our partnership with Triple M and Southern Cross Oz Stereo, that to work with them to produce a great podcast could be a really good opportunity for us to expose some of the personalities within our squad in a different way, and really introduce them to our audience. But also, I looked around rugby union in Australia and saw that none of the other Super Rugby clubs had a podcast. Rugby Australia didn't have an official podcast. Eddie Jones has started his own since he's come back as Wallabies coach, which I think is great to get that information direct from the source. So we pitched it to Triple M and said, as part of our partnership, would you consider producing a podcast? We'll bring the talent. We'll work with you on the content, and you guys use your expertise to do all the technical stuff, release it, promote it. And it's been fantastic. So the podcast is called Socks Up with Ryan Smith. Ryan's one of our players who is only in his third year of Super Rugby. Actually, a tradie, came through club rugby pathways, a bit of a mature age recruit, loves media, really wanted to give himself an opportunity to grow in that space. Really genuine guy, very funny, respected by his peers. So Ryan hosts the podcast. I'm there to chip in occasionally to keep things on track when he gets swept away, which he doesn't need me for, to be fair. He's so good at what he does. And then a special guest each week, and we delve into the stories and the news of what's happening at the club, but also the journeys of our players and what they've been through to be where they are today. So it's heaps of fun. The feedback's been fantastic. We know that our Rustodons love it, but importantly, it's not really granular and rugby heavy and terminology that will intimidate people. It's really designed that if you have a passing interest in the Reds, make sure you tune in. We know our players listen. We know players at the other teams are listening. And rather than thinking we want to own the space completely, I think it'd be great if the other Super Rugby teams decided to follow suit. It's a great way to, I don't want to say control the narrative, because it's not an overly media managed or scripted podcast. It's designed to be a bit off the wall and a bit of fun. Using something like the Gus and Gorney podcast from the Melbourne Footy Club as a bit of inspiration. But it's a great way for us to talk about what's happening without relying on somebody wanting to talk about it or write about it through an earned sense.
But also now we're seeing more and more with either players doing their own ones. The Kelsey brothers in the NFL, pretty much took the media world by storm, doing theirs every week, and then they end up in the Super Bowl. You've got players, NBA players, AFL players that are doing their own, and it has now evolved to media is now grabbing that quote, sometimes out of context, sometimes in context, and then it enters mainstream media. One of the peeves of mine over the past 10 years is where they would just quote it and they wouldn't even mention that it was on a podcast. And now they're like, oh, no, this was said and it was on the Reds podcast, or this is what Mason Cox said on his podcast. And so they're starting to play the game that is the internet of, hey, I heard it over here. It's a bit of a referral. Rising tides lift all boats. And then the good thing is that it's about the depth. You're not getting the stand in front of the sponsor logos with the mic and we're getting 45 seconds of your player, on the news, which is, great. You're getting, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and they get more comfort in doing media. But I'm guessing it helps develop more trust with your players and your comms team to be able to do more things as they get more comfortable around a microphone. You build trust with them to be able to sit down, do deeper dive pieces because they're, you keep doing podcasts because you enjoy it. So if they're enjoying doing it, then it makes other content pieces much easier to make.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan doesn't have to do it. He does it on his day off. He doesn't get paid for doing it. He does it because he genuinely wants to do it. And we said that to him right from the very start. We said, mate, we've identified you as someone we think would be fantastic. Are you interested? Tell us if you're not. Tell us if you think it'll become a chore at any point along the journey. And credit to him, he's just embraced it and absolutely loves it. I mean, great example to what you speak to. A couple of weeks ago, there was a bit of a headline. Clayton Oliver from the Melbourne Footy Club ahead of his 150th game on a podcast with Jai Simpkin, who I think he played his junior footy with, and he said, he told a story about how one of the recruiters from another club basically told him he was too fat in his draft year. Now a story like that's not going to come out at a media conference, the day before the game, stand up in front of the backdrop and half a dozen microphones shoved in your face. So to your point, creating that level of comfort, for Clayton to tell that story and the context around it, I just think it's great as a fan to have access to these athletes. We don't need to wait until they've retired to start to hear some of the stories of what shapes them. And I think, as we grow up with our latest generation are attracted as much to individuals as they are to teams in terms of how they follow sport. I think it's a great way for the athletes to put themselves in a position to also commercialise and build their brand, their personality, and prepare themselves for life beyond sport as well.
Yeah, definitely. And, they're just following what their role models have done. In previous years, you'd be looking at Michael Jordan and what he did in commercialising his likeness, and now you're looking at this generation's top tier athletes, your Tom Brady's, your LeBron James, and they're building media companies. They've got their own channels. They're managing their own messaging, but also they're building fandom by talking about what they love and what they do. And again, you don't have to start your own production company to do it, but chatting on a podcast, people go, "Oh, I'm going to follow that player because of what I hear them do," and that kind of thing. Lastly, before I just want to wrap up, one more question. You're also an adjudicator for the Guinness Book of Records. How did that come about? Is that what does that role entail?
Yeah, it's a good story. When I was working at the Rebels, we had a guy who used to take photos for us in the stands of game day, just of fans. He was an amateur photographer, great guy from the UK, and we'd catch up every month for a coffee. And he just said to me one day, "Hey, by the way, I know you do MC work, presentation work, you've done some radio stuff. A really good mate of mine works for Guinness World Records in the UK. They need a new Australian adjudicator. I thought of you. As a side job, would you be interested?" Which, of course, I was. I think, like most kids, I grew up with 1988 Guinness World Records was the one that we had kicking around from an op shop somewhere. So flew out, this is back in 2014, 2015, flew over to the UK, spent a couple of weeks at GWR HQ, and then since then kind of get the relatively sporadic, "Are you available on this date to travel to this location to adjudicate this attempt?" I don't have time to do a lot of it, and there's a couple of us now in Australia who do it, which is good. But it's been a great opportunity for me to. It's really wholesome, Sean. It's just unbridled joy when someone breaks a world record, and everyone who's attempting it, whether it's one person doing something or 20,000 people coming together, it's that almost childlike enjoyment of having a crack for the sake of it. So I really enjoy it. As I say, I don't do a lot of it, but I'll hang on to it as long as I can.
What's the process of determining what is valid for a record? Like, can I submit the largest sports business Zoom call during COVID? When I had like 80 people on the call and we're all talking about sports business, like. What are the parameters of saying, "Hey, is this worthy of being in the Guinness Book of Records"?
Well, I think submissions are always welcomed. I think there's around 50,000 active records in the database. I mean, what they generally try to do is steer clear of anything too specific. So, it might be more, the largest Zoom call for a charity fundraiser or something like that, rather than a sports business one. But there's a dedicated records management team over in the UK who would review any submission, and then from there they'd set some guidelines around how do you prove what you've done, where's the evidence, how do you submit that, and then also come up with what they think is a challenging number to reach. So I have adjudicated attempts, which is the first time anyone's ever done it, and the minimum standards are generally pretty high because they want to make sure that someone hasn't just come up with an idea and then know that they're going to break it. You really need to be pushing yourself.
So it's either go break someone else's record or come up with something that's still going to be pretty compelling to make the book.
Absolutely.
Terrific. Pete, I want to get to my Sports Geek closing five. Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
I do. I was lucky enough that Dad put me on the Melbourne Cricket Club list at a really young age, I think about 2 weeks after I was born. So a lot of my early childhood memories are at the MCG, and the one that really resonates would be 94-95 Ashes series. I think day 1 and 2, and if my memory serves me correctly, I was then sitting on Puffing Billy listening on the radio when Warnie took the hat-trick on either day 3 or 4. So that's the first that springs to mind.
Terrific. And you would have been a lot of sports events in your time. Do you have a go-to food or a favourite food memory at a sports event?
One that I always think of, which is maybe it's shaped by the fact that as a 15-year-old, I made Subway sandwiches for a part-time job. But we went to, when we were living in Sydney, went a couple of times down to Giants Stadium to watch matches there, and they've got a Subway outlet within Giants Stadium. And the reason it kind of sat with me is not because I necessarily eat a huge amount of Subway, but I think it just demonstrated that, the days of turning up at a stadium and having a lukewarm pie that sat in the Bain Marie or a $15 chicken burger that tastes like cardboard, don't need to endure, that we can go to a sporting event and have something personalised, made to order, that's at the same standard as what you would get outside if you weren't at the stadium. So that always just sat really well with me as a bizarre place to have a Subway. Outside of that, sitting down in the Hugh Trimble bar and the MCC members and having a chicken parma and a Carlton draft before a game of footy doesn't go badly either.
No, that sounds all right. What's the first app you open in the morning?
Lately, it's been the Premier League app. I'm in a couple of really competitive fantasy Premier League competitions, and I'm kind of around that top 100,000 in the world at the moment, which is well and truly above anything I've ever achieved. There's been a lot of midweek games, and I'm a diehard Leeds United fan, so I'm watching that relegation battle with close interest. So that'd be the one at the moment. It used to be emails, but I really try and move away from that, and I don't think that's a healthy way to start your day.
No, definitely not. Who should the podcast listeners follow, whether it's a colleague or an author or someone maybe you follow on socials?
Great question. Look, outside of this podcast, of course, my favourite podcast in Australia is The Sounding Board with Hutchie and Damo. I think if people are listening to this show, they're probably familiar with it, but it's a great, relaxed look at sporting media and a lot of fun. Outside of that, I thoroughly enjoy the journalism from The Athletic, whether it's reading their long-form features or listening to their podcasts. I think they've revolutionised the way that American and American sports and football in the UK are covered. And I couldn't recommend more highly investing the money in a subscription to enhance the quality of the content you're consuming.
Definitely. I'm a subscriber of The Athletic as well and could completely agree. Lastly, what social media platform is your MVP? And you can answer that both personally as yourself, which is what personally means, and also from a Queensland Reds QRU point of view.
Well, from a QRU point of view, I don't run the socials being in the role I'm in, so I'll probably leave that to the side. I've always loved Twitter. I love the ability to follow things live as they're happening, and whether that's following a press conference or being able to quickly, you might be out at dinner and you're not meant to be looking at your phone, but you've got a 2-minute window to try and check scores in 5 different leagues at the same time. Twitter does that really well, I think. Are you still
in love with Twitter, given the last 12 months under Elon's stewardship?
Yeah, well, I guess that's where I'd probably say that what I'm finding is that there's just less content. So slowly my feed is, there's not as many tweets to consume as people move away from the platform. So I think the curated list of who I follow is still serving its purpose, and I don't really delve too far outside of that. But I would say that I'm seeing less content come through, and if that trend continues, Twitter may have less use for me. I think LinkedIn. I'm a huge advocate for LinkedIn to connect with people, but to also celebrate achievements. And I know that LinkedIn can be viewed through a prism of blatant self-promotion, and there is that element to it, but at the same time, if I look through a commercial lens now, the QRU, if I'm able to really showcase something that we've done in collaboration with a partner, for example, and increase the audience who see that, that's beneficial for the QRU, paints us in a great light. It's beneficial for the partner as well. So if LinkedIn's used really genuinely, which I think most of the time it is, I think it's got a huge role to play.
Definitely. Obviously a massive proponent of LinkedIn, and Twitter's very much a wait and see, because the problem prior to Elon turning up was the fact that it wasn't growing, and it wasn't growing in engagement, and more people weren't using it. So they're not all his problems, because you're probably similar to me. You sort of get your following, and you're like, cool, I've got what I need, and so you don't go and get more accounts, and then the stats pretty much bear out that 90% of people on Twitter aren't tweeting. So you've got the power users doing most of the lifting. And if they leave, whether they be journalists and media or celebrities, then what is left in that feed, it can become quite barren. So it's still a bit of a wait and see. It's not I think there's still more plays to be played out there. But LinkedIn, it's a living, it's like a living Rolodex for mine. It's like, how do you keep in touch with people, and, finding out that people have moved from one role to another role. Like, not everyone's going to email you and tell you that they've moved on, but, LinkedIn will.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's great when you might, in my role, I might see, an organisation that signed a new sports partnership, and I might want to reach out and connect to someone from that organisation to see if they'd be interested in a chat with us. For example, that's the type of thing that's proved fruitful for us already, which sounds really simple, but if it's quite a targeted, and finessed approach, it can pay immediate dividends. I think LinkedIn's great for, obviously, just job hunting for, not job hunting in the sense that I'm looking elsewhere, but finding people who might be.
But it should be something like you do see the, people who, unfortunately, they fall out of work or looking for a role, and that's when they start doing LinkedIn. Whereas I've always been a active networker in LinkedIn. And so it does, just because you're connected with people doesn't mean you are looking for a job. But when you do need to, you're already in that space, and it's not as, waving a flag so much. And then, it also presents those opportunities. It might also be that someone you've got a great relationship with, which you've, had as a bit of a theme through this interview, does move to another place. You've already got that relationship, and that allows you to start a conversation with them about, what does a partnership or sponsorship or, a connection at their new role, what does that offer? I have people message me all the time, you're connected with so-and-so, can you connect me? Well, all of those connections have still got different levels. Like, just because we're connected doesn't mean, I know them and I can give them a call. But it's like, you've still got to curate, work on those relationships and make that network work for you, is probably my best advice.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. I think with LinkedIn, one thing I do is every 6 months I have a look through my connections, and I remove connections if it's somebody who either I don't know and I can't describe the link. Why are we connected? What's the possible play here? I don't like connecting people just for the sake of it. So yes, there's lots of people on there I've never met. There are people on there who I've never spoken to, but I can justify the value of the connection and that I might benefit from their activity or likewise them from mine. So I think keeping those connections authentic and having a purpose behind them makes LinkedIn, especially beneficial.
So this is where I normally will ask people, if you listen to this podcast and you want to reach out to Pete, please do so on LinkedIn, but please tell him that you listened to the podcast and what bit you enjoyed, because then it gives you some connection to go, now I know why we're connecting. So Pete, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. What is the best platform for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's a great one. It's unless you want to see photos of a 3-year-old and 1-year-old on Instagram, I'd probably recommend LinkedIn.
Cheers, Pete, and all the best.
Good on you, mate. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Why not book a Pick My Brain session with Sean Callanan? Go to sportsgeekhq.com/pickmybrain.
Thanks again to Pete. Send him a tweet. Reach out to him, Pete_Fairbairn. Send him a message that you listened, or comment on LinkedIn, on the LinkedIn post when I do share this episode. I really do appreciate it when listeners reach out to guests and say thank you. It really does mean a lot. And again, thanks again, Pete, for your time. I think that's the most times I've ever said again in an outro. But, just add another one. Maybe it'll make the record books one day. I just want to finish this one up with sort of continuing the conversation I just had with Pete around the value of podcasting and why more sports should be looking at podcasts as a content type and how it can be used, both as a means to connect with your fans and provide that deeper content piece, but then also, what it can be. It's a pretty cheap medium to do. You can do it, as I've been doing it for over 300 episodes, just in a pure audio form. And to do that, you just need a Zoom recorder and a room. And for the most part, you can get it done. Or, more and more podcasts are now video, and it seems to be one of the most prolific means of doing a podcast. And, a lot of YouTube channels are pretty much video interviews, whether they be in person or as we do them, video calls. So one, it's, as Pete said, it's a great way to develop trust with your players and develop your players as a marketing and a media performer. And it's just great longer form content. You get a little bit more depth in a 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute conversation than you would just in a 30-second, 45-second press conference. So it can allow your fans to create deeper ties, find new reasons and means to follow a player or follow your team. But the other thing is, I like the turkey analogy. There's lots to cut up and slice up with the longer form content that is a podcast. You'll see many, if you go to YouTube Shorts, many of them are clipped up answers from a video podcast. So it gives you a lot of great content for your Instagram Reels, your TikToks, your YouTube Shorts. And similarly to radio, it's relatively easy to commercialize if you design your podcast in an appropriate way, whether it be, sponsored segments and the like, or even just spoken word adverts inside your podcast. So if you would like to understand what, podcasting strategy might look like for you, happy to sort of give my advice over, I'm getting close to over nearly 500 episodes now of different podcasts that I've done with Sports Geek and a few others. So, happy. And it is one of my preferred means to consume content. So I'm a big believer in podcasting. I mean, it's just a quick review of like our podcast tech stack. We record on Riverside FM. So that's how I did the recording for Pete. That's how I'm also recording this outro. We do a lot of our design for our show notes in Canva, but they can be done, with Photoshop. That doesn't take too much to get your graphics in order around a podcast. We do a lot of the planning, both from a guest planning point of view and also the script and some of the steps required in post-production. We use Notion as a note-taking tool and leverage Notion AI to pull out some of the best bits from the transcripts. Shout out to my editor, James. He's the one that pulls together all of these pieces of audio to make it sound better. So thank you very much to James. I've got my producer, Jess, who helps coordinate the interviews. So it's really a three-person operation in getting the podcast out. And then some other tech we use Orphonic, which is a really good tool to appropriately tag your MP3s to make sure it's tagged correctly for Apple. And it also can do some leveling and the like if you don't have a terrific podcast editor like I do. And then we use Libsyn as our host, and it does all the distribution that we require. So it makes sure it gets to Apple Podcasts, make sure it gets to Spotify and the like. And make sure one of the key things for web hosting and podcast hosting, as long as is that it's fast. If you're just hosting your MP3 files on a file format and it's not optimized for listening, someone will hit play and it'll take a long time, and that can actually affect both the listening and also the ratings around Apple Podcasts, because they'll remember that it takes ages for people to download. So I highly recommend Libsyn. Been using them for over 10 years now. So that's sort of my review. As always, if you're interested in learning more about podcasts, how you might be able to use them with your business or with your team or with your league, happy to discuss what a podcasting strategy might be. Before I wrap up, just want to check in. Have you registered for Seat in Salt Lake City yet? July 14, 15. I'm really looking forward to it. I've already been having some conversations with different people that I have met over the journey at Seat. Looking forward to seeing them again. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/seat to find out more. Probably the best way to know more is to listen to my episode with Josh Barney, the new CEO of Seat. You can go to episode 325, which is sportsgeekhq.com/325. To find out more, and really excited about some of the companies that I'm going to talk about in the Seat Sports Geek Amplify series as well, that's going to come out in May. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to Sports Geek.
Don't miss out on the latest news and updates from the sports industry. Sign up for the Sports Geek News email newsletter today and stay informed on the latest trends, insights, and analysis from the world of sports. Sign up at sportsgeekhq.com. Want to help drive more revenue from your digital efforts? Book a time for a call. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call. For more resources, go to sportsgeekhq.com.